Hello, and welcome to Identifying and Selecting Materials for Digital Preservation, a learning module adapted for the Digital POWRR Peer Assessment Program. This program has been generously funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services. I'm Carol Kussmann, Digital Preservation Analyst at the University of Minnesota Libraries, and I will be presenting this digital preservation module to you today. Before we jump into identifying and selecting materials for digital preservation, I want to set the stage with a few definitions. First off, what are we talking about when we say digital materials or digital content? Digital materials are any arbitrary item created, published, or distributed in a digital form, including but not limited to text, data, sound recordings, photographs and images, motion pictures, and software. As memory institutions and libraries, many of us are responsible for holding and providing access to other people's digital content. So how do we ensure digital content is available for use? We need to preserve it. Digital preservation is the active management of digital content over time to ensure ongoing access. Digital preservation is not simply backing up your data. In the analog world, you can put a book on a shelf, and as long as it stays dry, you can feel fairly certain that you will be able to read it in 50 years. With digital objects, you can't just put it on a shelf and expect to open it 50 years from now. It needs to be managed over time to ensure that you can still access it. Think of digital preservation as a series of management activities that may include things like fixity checking, making sure the files have not changed or become corrupted over time. Media migration or refreshing files, moving files from one media type to another, such as transferring files from a CD to a hard drive or from one hard drive to another. Format migration, changing the file format from a less stable to a more stable or standardized one. And file identification and validation, making sure files are what they say they are. Management activities also include creating policies and procedures that indicate what strategies and actions will be used to preserve your digital objects. This could include procedures on how to use specific tools, procedures on how to transfer content, policy around what to do with the original media the objects were stored on. Do you give it back? Do you keep it? Do you destroy it? And policies around when to migrate to different file formats. Keep in mind that what we are going to talk about today is just one piece of this puzzle. In order to preserve materials, some of the types of activities that are being done are identifying and selecting materials, storing and protecting them, and managing them over time to be able to preserve and provide access to them. Today, we're going to focus on the identify and select aspect of digital preservation activities. So think about your collections or the donations that you receive. While the focus of your collections may be on organizational records or personal papers, what types of materials do you have? You may have a combination of images, word processing documents, audio and video files, and website, social media, and other types of content. So thinking about all of this content that you have is the first step to being able to identify your content. So it's important for us to be able to identify the content that we have in order to be able to preserve it. You can't preserve your digital content if you don't know what you have. And it makes it more difficult to communicate your needs to management or your funders if you don't know what you have as well. We identify content because it also helps us to identify our own resource needs. Preservation requires an explicit commitment of resources. I hear from people all the time that they don't have the resources and support for a good digital preservation plan or program. To get the resources and support to preserve your digital materials, it could definitely help if you were able to take a concrete document that shows just how much you need to have taken care of. Effective planning is based on knowing the extent of what will be preserved. It's great to say we need storage space and management software, but when the inevitable question is raised, how much space do you need and what kind of management software do you need? You need to have the documentation to back up your claims. This goes along with identifying, your resource needs. Not all digital content in and around an organization will be preserved. If you are in a one-person department, you may know where everything is and have an idea about what you have. But if you get hit by a bus tomorrow, because sorry, buses happen, nobody else is going to have any earthly idea about what is going on. It's a great recipe for data loss. So you need to be able to document what you have, what you should have, and what should or should not be kept. And an inventory is the best way to document your content. Good preservation decisions are based on the understanding of the possible content to be preserved. And it's a foundational step for digital preservation. An inventory can help you keep track of the content you currently have, the content that you will likely have in the near future or further out, and any content that is required to be kept by law. When you set out to create an inventory, what you put into it, the information that you're gathering, is more important than what it looks like or what format it is in. And it is important to understand why you are creating the inventory and what information you are after. That should be known before you get started. For example, do you want to know what digital content is in your own department or across the institution? Do you want to know what digital content might be in a backlog, such as sitting on disks in boxes, versus the new materials coming in? Or do you just need to know what has resulted from digitization projects? Once you know your goal or goals, you can move forward. An inventory should be documented, write it down and save it. It should be usable, a simple format that's easy to sort and share. Available. It should be available and accessible to your team, your managers, and anyone else that would need to see it. And it should be scalable, so you can add additional content or information to it in the future. And it should be kept current. The most useful type of inventory stays up to date. So you should have plans on keeping the inventory up to date and updating it periodically. In thinking about the scope or level of details in your inventory, think about what you have. How much content do you plan on inventorying? Will you inventory the files within one unit or department? Or perhaps just the files received in the past 3 months? Or maybe your focus is on the backlog of digital materials stored on media in boxes that you have. Think about where the content is housed and what type of content it is, or how varied it is. Will you be inventorying things across various network drives, multiple computer hard drives, the cloud? And if the content is varied, will that make it more difficult to complete your inventory? What available resources do you have? Who is available and what other resources do you have to complete the inventory? Set the scope of your inventory to be something that can be completed in a reasonable amount of time by the people who have the time to complete it. Do not say that you will have one person inventory all of your assets in a week. That's just not realistic. Make the goal obtainable. Create a timeline or deadline by which to complete the inventory. That is extremely helpful. And like many other things, the task can fall by the wayside and never get completed if this is not done. So, reality check. What do you have time to do? Don't make this too big of a project. And keep in mind that having multiple smaller inventories are acceptable too. You don't need to inventory everything at once. Another way to control the scope is to adjust the level of detail being captured in the inventory. Inventories can range from being very general to very specific. you need to determine the appropriate level of detail for you and the project at hand. So some inventory tips before you get started. This should not be complicated. Use what you have. Avoid delaying the inventory process by searching for or trying to implement the perfect or a new piece of software. If you do that, implementing the software will become the focus rather than the focus of completing the inventory itself. Be consistent, comprehensive, and concise. Don't avoid starting or completing the inventory. And try not to let things delay the progress once it has started. And focus on the significant properties of the materials based on what you need to know. Do you need to know file formats, or just the total size, or just the type of materials? Remember your goals and your predetermined scope. Here are some examples of software that you can use to keep an inventory. Remember, it doesn't have to be complicated. An Excel spreadsheet on a shared network drive works. A Microsoft Word document on a shared network drive. A Google document or spreadsheet with access for those who need it. And a database format that is familiar for everyone working with the collection. And then one of the things you want to make sure of is making sure that the software is something that everyone involved has access to and that they understand how to use it. Fields that might be useful in an inventory may include a field for content, format, location, date, and size. Many of these fields could have multiple meanings, but the definitions are based on your goals and your inventory scope. And I'm going to discuss the differences in a little bit more detail on the next slides. Content. Determining what content will be inventoried helps with scope. It could be that the records that you want to include in an inventory may be institutional records, emails, reports, financial records. You may want to focus on special collection materials, all of them or only certain special collections. Scholarly content, either licensed or open or both. Research data. It may be of interest as a separate category due to grants or funding requirements. Web content is another area that is often collected and perhaps stored differently than other materials, but may be a good candidate for an inventory as it's also part of your total assets. And your inventory could include all of these or one of these. It is completely up to you and your goals. Format and or file types. The information you want to capture about this field also depends on the scope of your inventory. For example, if you're trying to understand just the types of materials in your holdings, or is that what you want to do? Or do you want to get more granular and know more about specific file types? In your inventory, you can identify format types within categories of contents, such as, do you have just images, video, audio files? Are your materials mostly text? Or do you have content such as maps or drawings? What about web content or other types of structured data, such as databases? Knowing that general information may be all that you need to know about your inventory. But you may also want to know what types of images, what types of video files, or what types of text documents. And if you do want to know those details, you can have a field that provides information about the specific file formats, such as JPEG, TIFF, MP3, WAV files, XML, or Word documents. So you may want to use just the general category, or you may want to start listing file formats. Looking at media type, it may be useful to record information about the media that the files are on, as the lifespan of media varies. At different points in time, you're going to need to think about replacing media. And there's a reason that external hard drives, when you buy them, only have a 2 to 3 year warranty. They aren't expected to last forever. However, if your scope of your inventory is to inventory materials that are all stored on the same server, this may not be important to you. Unlike if you are going through boxes in your archives, where you could run into various media types. So keep in mind, if you look at this infographic, the life of a CD listed here ranges between 5 and 100 years. These are vendor estimates. Most CDs are closer to the 5-10 year range in reality. Documenting the location of where content is stored will be helpful when the content needs to be moved, either moved to a new server, deposited into the archives, things like that. So consider documenting a general location. For example, is the content with you? Is it with a third party? Is it still with the creator? Who currently has it in their possession and who is responsible for it? If your inventory doesn't cover multiple general locations, this may not be valuable information to track. Another type of location to track may be what type of media is it on? So that's kind of going back to the media type. But it could also be considered a type of location. Is it a network drive? Is it online storage? Is it a hard drive? Is it a DVD? When you want to be more specific in tracking locations, determine if there is an easy way to record that information. For example, if you want to track the location in a network storage area, you can often cut and paste the location from the Windows menu. Depending on your systems that you're using, you may also be able to link directly to that location. And these types of options are going to be based on your storage system. And your inventory in general should be flexible enough so that you can document changes in the location as the content moves, as you update your inventory over time. So in thinking about this, you want to be clear enough without going into extremes. The example on the slide here shows a path to a folder on a network drive. This entry is documenting the location for files considered to be miscellaneous within the YMCA collection of our electronic records archive. Date considerations. Date is another field that may be repeated depending on what you are trying to capture. Some examples of the dates you may want to capture include the date of creation of your digital file, the date range that the content covers. So all of the files within a folder cover a certain time period. Perhaps you want to record information about the date the files were received or the date the inventory was completed. That would allow you to know that the location information is accurate as of the date that you wrote that down. Keep in mind that each of these dates would get recorded into a different field. You can't mix up different types of dates. And most likely, you will not be capturing all of these. Think about what makes the most sense for you in your inventory. Let's take a look at some inventory examples. One example is an inventory taken at the collection level. The goal for this type of inventory may be to see what digital items are currently being brought into collections. You want to know what file types are being brought in, the number of files, and the space they take up. Another example may be a bit more detailed, and it could be at the item level. The goal of an item level inventory is often to get a better understanding on a smaller set of materials at that deeper level. These most often would be done on a smaller set of files, such as an individual collection, rather than on many collections. So looking at a collection level example, this collection level example is from the University of Minnesota Libraries, Archives, and Special Collections. And the goal here was to see what digital items are currently being brought into the collections. So the scope includes information about all the content coming in from the 15 different units in the archives. And here are the fields that they chose. The unit, so it was a drop down of the one out of 15 units. Collection title, the record creator, the record donor. Perhaps it's the same as the creator, but not always. A general description to get an overview of the type of materials, a total size, file formats, and where the materials are currently stored. This table shows what that might look like. Our actual inventory is a Google spreadsheet, but this just is giving an example of the unit, recording of the collection title, creator, donor, a description, total size, the file formats, and the current storage location. So this next example is for an item level inventory, where the goal is to get a better understanding of individual collections. The fields that are of interest include a title, date created, a local identifier, an MDL identifier, the date the item was digitized, the preservation file format and file size, and the location for the access and preservation files. There's a lot of detailed information that needs to be recorded for every file on the item level. Thankfully, there are tools out there that can help you analyze this data and assist in creating a base inventory for you. Many programs can pull technical metadata such as date, location, file path, file name, file formats to make this process easier. This is an inventory that was created from descriptive and technical information stored in content DM. The data was exported as a tab delimited text file, open in Microsoft Excel, and then saved to create a basic item level inventory. So staff didn't have to create this by hand, but we still have the title, the date, the identifiers, the master file format, file size, access location, preservation location. So it's a good way to be able to get that item level inventory. So in wrapping up the identifying aspect of digital preservation, we've discussed how it is important to identify the content that you have so you can have a complete picture to help answer questions on how to move forward. We've talked about how to create an inventory and listed some possible categories of information to include on an inventory. And remember that you can use your inventory as a management tool that changes as your program grows, or you can use it to help prepare yourselves for understanding your future preservation environments, for example, understanding how much space you will need. And you may also use the inventory as a basis for determining if you acquired content or not, do you have the space, as well as helping to define collection policies or setting up budgets for your digital materials. So after we've completed our inventory, if you don't set some priorities, it can be easy to get overwhelmed with what you have found. Not all of the content that you have may in fact be appropriate or necessary for you to preserve. And you don't want to commit resources to preserving materials you don't have to. Different types of organizations use different terms for this selection process, but they all produce the same result, which is deciding what to keep. Libraries might use the term selection, archives appraise the records, or follow a records retention schedule to determine what to keep. And museums often talk about acquisitioning or accessioning records. Keep in mind that the terms all refer to the same type of actions, and they may be used interchangeably. But for today, we're just going to be calling it selection. The basic steps for selection require you to review your potential digital content. So start with the outcome of your inventories. Look it over. What do you have? And think about what you might have still coming in. Understand the implications of keeping those materials. Define and then apply criteria for what you will select to preserve. It is the best way to ensure consistency across an organization over time and over staffing changes. Document and preserve your selection decisions. Why are you keeping things? What is your rationale? You, your staff, and your successors need to understand why you chose to keep particular content. Don't assume that it's obvious to everyone. Collecting policies, accepting specific file formats, or focusing on specific collecting areas really helps to define and document your criteria and selection decisions. Implement your decisions and stick to the criteria. Don't take in or keep content not in your defined scope of preservation. Review your selection criteria regularly to ensure that they meet your needs. They are there to ensure consistency and can also be a helpful tool in controlling what content comes your way. It's an argument in your arsenal for those times when you need to say no to somebody, which is very helpful. You mean I can't keep it all? No, and you don't really want to either. But the selection process is also going to be one of the most challenging for us because most of us tend to be able to want to keep everything, especially in the digital world, because it doesn't cause us any anxiety to keep things in the digital space because it's not cluttering up our workspace. So why can't we keep it all? Some reasons we may not be able to keep everything is quality. Not all materials may be of preservation quality. Think about blurry images. If you have both blurry and non-blurry images of an event, do you need to keep the blurry ones? What about drafts of final reports? Are they important? For reports, probably not. For a book, maybe. What resources do you have available? Think about your technological, personnel, and financial resources. It is not responsible to take in materials that you can't manage. Eventually, we're all going to have backlogs. We just need to have a plan to be able to manage them. What does your environment look like? Are you able to scale it and stay current as needed? This is similar to understanding your available resources. And scope. This is your collecting policy. This is that selection aspect. You want to only keep items based on your documented policies and criteria. Focus on the priorities or interests of your organization. And you need to remember that digital materials require long-term management. We can't put them on a shelf or a storage area and forget about them. We need to monitor them over time to make sure that they are still accessible. And the following slides go into a little bit more detail on these reasons. When thinking about quality and significance of contents, not all digital content is going to be preservation quality. You probably don't want to keep corrupted images, blurry pictures, too many pictures of the same thing. In this case, my kid really loves red pandas, but do I really need to keep all of these? What about data sets with no documentation? Are they useful to anybody if we don't know what they are? If you have high resolution photos, do you also need to preserve the lower quality ones of those same images? And not all content will be significant enough to warrant preservation. That string of emails about organizing the staff Christmas party, for example, or setting up a lunch, do you really want to keep those? Available resources. You may hear people argue that storage is cheap, so let's just keep everything. Unfortunately, that perspective is rather short-sighted. Yes, in general, the cost of storage is often going down, so we can get more storage for the same cost. However, the average size of a file is going up, so it's going to take more space to save an individual file than it did in the past. And this is especially true with images and video. The first example on this table shows a JPEG that at 3 megapixels took up 2.6 megabytes. That same file at 15 megapixels takes up 10.2 megabytes, or 5 times the size. The majority of these show a 5 times increase in size. And if you're doing digital preservation as suggested, you're going to be saving multiple copies of the same item in multiple locations. So thinking about what we have now, newer phones are producing images that are about 12 megapixels to start with. So we're already looking at that higher megapixel image, that higher megabyte storage space. You also need to consider your other resources. Financial, personnel, other systems. What do you have? What do you need and what can you get? If you are a lone arranger, don't try to do it all. Pick and choose what you think is most valuable. Try not to create a backlog that's too big to ever get through. Do you have financial backing for the preservation of digital materials? Even if you can't get to them right away, is digital preservation a priority for your organization? One of the ways to help narrow down what you keep is by using your documented collection policy and selection criteria. Making the decision on what objects to keep takes a lot of different skills. So think about your available resources as personnel as well. So it's helpful to have people with analytical skills, being able to review and understand the content, identifying the relationships and significance of those records, and making consistent decisions is a difficult process. Interpersonal skills help with being able to explain to all stakeholders why these decisions need to be made and why effort is being spent on the selection process. It is important to be able to communicate clearly and compellingly. And technical skills are also important. Not only do we need to understand the significance of the content, but we also need to understand details about the digital records themselves. How feasible is it to preserve the content if we do keep it? Is the content already in a format that is unreadable? Is it worth the effort to try and make it readable? And we need to think about the feasibility of long-term preservation and access of the materials we would like to keep. These types of skills or tasks often fall to different people within an organization. For example, a curator might be best suited to answer questions about the content. A preservation analyst or IT staff may assist on formats, and legal counsel or another person familiar with legislation could address any legal concerns. Hopefully, you don't have to do all of this alone, but when you do, work on developing skills in each of these areas. Look outside of your organization. Find people who can help, ask questions, develop relationships, and work with others to develop the best policies and workflows on selecting digital content. Long-term management needs. Digital materials are not as easy to preserve long-term as analog materials are. With analog materials, assuming no outlying preservation needs, once we're done processing them, we can often put them on a shelf in a location with good temperature and humidity controls and leave them there and be pretty confident that they will be the same as when we left them years and years down the road. However, digital materials need constant care and feeding. We need to manage every digital object that is saved, and we need to look at them and understand the cost of preserving materials over the long term. Digital objects require that constant care, and some objects are going to take more care and feeding than others. In addition to the storage costs, you're looking at the costs of creating, recording, and preserving metadata, the time it takes to develop a preservation plan to care for objects, and the ongoing documentation. Files must be monitored for corruption. Have you lost bits? Are those files degrading? Have they become corrupted? Monitoring files takes place on a regular basis. You will also need to perform migrations, either migrating or refreshing files to a more stable format or moving on to a new storage location. This is also not a one-time thing. You will receive digital materials continuously, which means you will be continuously ingesting, storage, managing, and providing access to these files. So as you select objects, think about what your current and future technological environment looks like. How big is it now, or will it be? How fast will you outgrow it? Also think about staffing. Do you have enough staff to work with the materials you want to preserve? Do they have the right skills? What is your financial situation? How sustainable are your practices? Common selection criteria. To start evaluating your content, you should have a list of criteria in which to compare it to. Some common selection criteria include working from your organization's collection policies to help determine value. Your organization may also have collecting priorities, which may change over time. Some organizations may focus on timely priorities, such as a historical anniversary as a 50th or 100th anniversary, or the starting or ending of an event such as World War I or World War II. Are there any mandates for your organization to preserve certain record types or series, such as state publications or email correspondence? Do the records or objects have historical, evidential, or research value? Are they unique? Is this the only source for this information? And also think about risk factors related to the records you have in your office. Think about the file formats. Are they known or unknown? Do we have the knowledge to access it and preserve it? And can we make sure it stays usable over time? And what about the current storage condition? Did it come on a format that might be at risk, such as a floppy disk? So thinking about the general selection criteria, there are also some more specific questions you can ask yourself to address the content of the material, the format, and other issues. So when you're going to go through these questions, some people say stop or don't keep it when the first question is no. But I think that you really need to kind of answer all of these questions and weigh your options. For example, under content, does the content of the object itself merit acquisition? Does it fit your scope? Is there a non-digital version of that object? And is the digital necessary? Does the value of keeping the object in digital form long-term outweigh the costs over time? Think about that migration, conversion, metadata creation and maintenance, backups that are needed, and your staff time and skills. And think about how access would be provided to that object. Questions for format. What is the file format of the digital object? How sustainable is that over time? Is it proprietary? Is it open source? Is it obsolete? And how easily can the format be converted to another for either preservation or access purposes? And some other things to think about, kind of on the technical, legal, access side of things. What media is the digital object on? Is the required equipment or software available to transfer this to the archives? Are there any access restrictions or copyright issues that prohibit or limit the access and use? And how would access be provided to the object? So these are all things, kind of very specific questions that you might want to ask. And you would change these questions based on the type of archives that you have and what your priorities are. Once you have your selection criteria in mind and documented, it may not be possible to review or select everything at once. So how might you sequence that process? Again, the answer will be different for each organization, but start evaluating your content. You should think about how to set priorities. Perhaps you want to focus on the most significant things for your organization. This may be documented in your collection policies or the priorities for your organization. Or perhaps it's based on the most requested or used materials. Another focus may be on a large collection or type of materials. An extensive collection of materials could be a large coherent body of materials to manage. Going along with that, that may be one of the easiest things to tackle. It could be that large collection, or easiest could be the most familiar to you, the most ready to ingest, or other low-hanging fruit. Whether that's dealing with easy formats, homogeneous collections, a small collection, collections that you know a lot about. All of those types of things fit into this bucket of easy in quotation marks. These types of things are also a quick win for your digital preservation process, and can be very helpful when you are having to prove the value of your efforts to a reluctant administration. Another thing you might want to focus on are the oldest materials, and that may address materials with a possible historical interest or importance, or materials that are most at risk. While a focus on the newest materials could spark some interest due to the immediacy of the content. For example, when I was at the state archives, we had to process the governor's records immediately because there was noise about him running for president, and it was known that the records were going to be of interest. Or perhaps you focus on records that you are mandated to keep. Mandates may be via local policies or legislation. Either way, you know that these are records you are responsible for and need to address sooner rather than later. You may also use risk to set priorities, and that kind of takes on a lot of different lenses. So think about if materials were no longer available, what digital files would be the hardest to replace? Or some file formats become obsolete a lot faster than others. PDFs are viable for a really long time, or some video formats that may use Flash get old very quickly. The technology is changing. So you want to look at file formats. Is it known or is it unknown? Is it obsolete? And then also, once again, thinking about like that current storage condition. Is it on a piece of older media? So another thing to consider is the value, more about the value of the material. Does it have historical, evidential, or research value? And think about costs. Is it going to be expensive? Can you afford to store a large collection of uncompressed video, even if it fits within your collection scope? Perhaps you need to consider storing smaller versions of the video files as a compromise. So these are all things to think about when trying to select materials. And it really is a balancing act on deciding what it is that you want or can keep. You need to consider the answers to your specific selection criteria questions. You need to understand the practicality of keeping the content in question. And you need to work within your institutional priorities. It's all part of that balancing act, and how you decide to prioritize is going to depend on a lot of different things. But keep in mind, there is no correct way to do this. So one of the ways that I've dealt kind of with this balancing act is one time I was charged with reviewing content from 12 CDs that were found in a collection. And the goal was to remove those CDs from the boxes and preserve the content on them, because we all know that the CDs are going to degrade over time. So keeping them in the box was not an option. So the CDs themselves contained Word documents, PDFs, website captures, and lots of images. So due to the nature of this collection, I compared the Word documents and PDFs to our paper records. If we already had them in paper form, I could discard the digital copy. If not, I actually printed the digital file and added it to the paper collection. This was only feasible because of how the records were labeled and how the paper records were cataloged. It was very easy to find duplicates. Without this, the records may have just all been printed because the total amount of those Word and PDF files was not very high. And this decision was made because paper is easier to preserve, and immediate access to the records was not a high priority. So the balance of access and preservation and cost to preserve the digital files, outweighed that over time. Another thing that I had to do is look at the images, which made up the majority of the content on those CDs. Reviewing images can take up a lot of time. What do you review for? Content, documentation of an event, quality. How do you do this? How do you know when to stop? And these were all things that I thought about and discussed with our team when trying to balance the amount of work to do. We had to determine if it was going to be worth the time and effort it was going to take me to review every photograph. In this case, the file naming structure of the folders of the images was a great help. They often listed an event name and a date. So I could compare those to our hard copies of photographs to see if the events were already represented in the collection. For those that were, I didn't have to keep the digital images. For those that were not, I did end up looking at nearly all of the photographs. but I was immediately able to delete poor quality images. There were a lot of really blurry images that were of use to nobody. I probably kept more than I normally would have, but as part of the evaluation, the quantity of the images I had to look through and determine like which of the 5 or 10 I wanted to keep per event was not worth the storage space that it would have saved. These images were taken in the early 2000s, and the file sizes were so small that even deleting 100 images would not have saved much space. In comparison, this collection had 10 times more images than a more recent collection I took in had, but it took up the same amount of space. So 10,000 images versus 1,000 images. So after kind of that initial weeding, it wasn't worth deleting anymore. It wasn't worth time to select those more specific images. So that's just an example of, kind of looking at the balancing act. So document your decisions. So now that you've looked at your records in more detail and have started making decisions, how do you make this process easier? You want to document your decisions so you don't have to start from scratch each time. Document the decisions you make as you make them on both large and small projects and collections. These decisions will help to create consistency as well as explain any inconsistencies. Documenting decisions will also assist with being consistent and help with being able to create those policies, procedures, and workflows. Sample procedures and workflows can be built around digital formats, a record series, a record type, a collecting area. It doesn't matter, but kind of it's the chicken and egg, being able to write those policies and procedures as well as knowing and understanding what it is you have. So they kind of go hand in hand. And documentation will also help explain and provide a reason for a decision, especially when you seem to have strayed away from the normal decision. So for example, going back to those 12 CDs, I said they also included website files. It was our policy at the time not to preserve websites. However, we decided to preserve those files due to the record creator and their use of the website. So we needed to carefully document why that one website was saved, whereas others were not. We didn't want to set a precedent that websites were now okay to preserve. So another result of selecting content is that you gain a better understanding of your records. And you can use this information to enhance the inventory you created by adding additional information to it, or you can use the information from the inventory and the selection process to help create a preservation plan. So useful information to add to an inventory or to record in a preservation plan may include description. So more detailed description than what you had in your inventory. It's assumed that inventory looked at basic information. So add descriptive details on how your inventory is designed. Add ID categories, collection names, unique identifiers. Extent. You can add more information on how much content there is and needs to be preserved. And will any more content be added to that in the future? That can help with estimating costs. For example, did the content come to you as part of a digitization project, so it's complete? Or are you expecting more content, perhaps on an annual basis from a donor? Use. Describe how the content will be used. Is it active? Does it have a lifespan or a retention schedule? And will that use change over time? And access and rights details. With more information about the content, rights and ownership issues might also be known now, and you can document that. Are there embargo periods that must be followed, or are there copyright concerns? How is access going to be provided? All of these are useful things that could be added to your inventory or a preservation plan. So in thinking about creating a preservation plan, just like an inventory, a preservation plan is what you want it or need it to be. You can create a plan for each collection, each accession, each format type, each record series, or a preservation plan could be a single document for your organization. What it is and how it is created is up to you. Develop something that works well with your workflows, but be flexible. You might want to modify it or change it in the future. In general, the preservation plan should document your preservation descriptions or your preservation decisions, such as what formats are you going to keep, information about storage, the type and location of the preservation files, access files, and the original files. Information about the digital content. So in general, and at that level that you need, is the collection level good enough? Do you need it down to an item level? Is it based on a donation or an accession? And that plan can be used to support or be used as a building block to create preservation policies to help you build a stronger preservation program. So these are some selected fields in a preservation plan. This is from the Minnesota State Archives. And the fields listed here were captured in an Access database spreadsheet. So after the information was captured, it's then printed as a report that can be filed with the accession paperwork. So information that's recorded in this plan helps us understand the accession, including the accession number, the date the accession was appraised and who appraised it. The location of the preservation and access copies is documented. Any access or use restrictions are recorded. A description of the digital records, any related records and associated metadata is captured. A section on the file formats with notes about risk or concerned is added and can be reviewed at any time. The current and expected quantity of files. The level of service field determined how important the objects were. Were they replaceable or irreplaceable? For example, are these digital copies of analog materials that could be replaced if needed, or are they the only copies available? File naming schemes are documented if they exist. Schemes are common for digitized files, but are not as common with other born digital materials. But you may find that some exist, which helps us kind of understand the files themselves. And you can document some of that information in your plan. And the last two fields are getting into the preservation side of things. So documenting the dates the content was verified, so making sure that the content hasn't changed over time. And recording the date the materials were last backed up, the location of the backups, and the plan for the next backup. And so what's nice about this preservation plan is that it can be printed on a single sheet of paper. And so it's really quick to look at to be able to understand what your collection or accession looks like. So selection also is not a one-time task. New content is always being offered, which will need to be reviewed. In addition, there may come a time where you will need to reappraise content and reselect content for the objects you've previously decided to keep. While this may never happen or may be a long way off, documenting policies, procedures, and priorities is going to make that selection easier now and in the future. And your selection criteria should be reviewed over time. Collecting policies and priorities might change, so be flexible. To assist with this ongoing process, be proactive and work with creators and donors when possible. It's important to develop relationships before records are transferred, so a majority of the content can be pre-selected or weeded out before it comes through your door. Identify a list of materials to review with them, discuss why, how is it better for them to be able to help select those materials, and then document the results and keep them informed on the work that you're doing with the materials. We all know that it's really hard to say no or hit the delete button on these things once they come through the door. But sometimes it needs to be done. So to summarize, the benefit of effective selection includes formalizing your processes with documentation. So having collection policies and procedures, donor agreements, retention schedules, and processing workflows helps keep everyone on the same track. And when you do an inventory and walk through the selection process with various collections and types of records, you are better able to create useful and therefore followable documentation. This is one of the most effective ways to get usable documentation. Why should you go through this selection process? It helps you focus your resources on the materials most important to your organization. Like we said before, storage costs might be getting less and less, but we are getting more and more and larger content. Selection helps to focus our limited resources to produce the maximum result. This process helps you know what you want or need to preserve. And using this responsible curation technique may assist with getting additional funding. When you go through this process, you get a better understanding of your digital content. This additional information can be used to add details to your inventory and to help you create a preservation plan. The more you know, the more control you have over your content, the easier it is to explain why things are important. Throughout this process, you are gaining and sharing knowledge and spreading the word about the importance of digital preservation as well. Make connections and allies to assist you with your efforts as you move forward. What may have started as a one-time or pilot project can turn into a sustainable program if you document your actions and build your case. Identifying and selecting digital content that is valuable for you to preserve is just one step in preserving your materials. Documenting your decisions on how and why you identify and select the materials is valuable not only for you, but for your organization to understand current and past decisions, which may be reevaluated in the future as the needs of your organization change. What doesn't change is the ongoing nature of digital preservation. Identifying materials, selecting which need to be stored and protected and managed over time is the part of the process of actively managing a digital object for as long as required in a form which is authentic and making the materials accessible to users. Think about how you can develop your own inventory and preservation plans from which to build your future activities on. Thank you for taking the time to listen and learn with us. Unless otherwise noted, the illustrations in the slides are courtesy of Digital POWRR, and the slides of this recording are based on content from the Introduction to Digital Preservation webinar series hosted by Minitex, which was created by Carol Kussmann from the University of Minnesota Libraries and Sara Ring from Minitex. Thank you.